Welcome to Chatham House. It's fabulous to see all of you here this evening for what is an extraordinarily important topic, one that I think for so many of us are following, expert or non-expert, casual expert, serious expert. I think all eyes are on the United States, on the US economy, COVID-19, and prospects for a recovery. I'm Leslie Benjamori. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House. Tonight's session, I should say, is on the record. We are recording. I hope that it will be very interactive, that you will all be very engaged. As you know, we have two really tremendous speakers that are joining us this evening. Jim O'Neill, Lord O'Neill, is chairman of Chatham House. He is a tremendous supporter of the US and Americas program here at Chatham House. I personally am deeply grateful to him for his ongoing advice and support of us on every level. So thank you, Jim, for doing this. Jim is known to many of you mostly for being chairman of Chatham House. But he was obviously, he had a few other jobs. He was previously Commercial Secretary of the Treasury under Prime Minister Cameron. He spent most of his career at Goldman Sachs, helping us to understand the importance of emerging economies and especially the BRICS. I'll never forget the day that the BRICS report landed on my desk at Georgetown. He is a member of the House of Lords and has many other commitments, some of them I believe in Manchester. Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce and welcome our distinguished guests. I would just say, Larry Summers, thank you so much for joining us. We know you have many things you can do with your time, but we are supremely grateful and honored. So thank you so much. Jim, over to you. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I'm pleased to hear that you just welcome Larry, because I haven't seen Larry on my system anywhere, so it's.
Hi, Jim. Can you hear me?
Hey, Larry. How are you? Nice to see you.
Yes, good.
That's a very nice.
I'm glad we're connected successfully here.
That's a great relief. Listen, I'm not going to waste too much of this valuable time by going through Larry's staggering past. I occasionally get introduced in far too flattering circumstances. Leslie just had a go at it there myself, and I am reasonably proud of my past, but goodness me, what a real pleasure it is for us to have you here, Larry. You are definitely one of the most influential economists of my generation. I've never said this before in your presence, but that's often in my view, because unlike a lot of our fellow economists, you often show tendencies of living in the real world rather than just in a textbook. And of course, you've had staggering achievements and influence. Everybody, I'm sure, on the call knows that Larry was Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton. And that's after, I think, Larry, I'm right in saying, to be the youngest ever chief economist of the World Bank. And has been a huge influence on many people driving the United States, even before Bill Clinton, and certainly since. I think you headed up the NEDC under Obama, has been on top of all of this president of Harvard, and has an incredibly important set of functions that he's influencing over today. I'm also very pleased and important to say that Larry and I spent a bit of time a few years ago in our mutual interest in trying to do things about the challenges of health, specifically antimicrobial resistance. Larry was very helpful for us in DC on a couple of events we did for that, which I'll be always eternally grateful to. As an aside, it looks like we weren't influential enough in preparing the world for the kind of things that we now face. I could go on, but Larry, it's an absolute honor, and I just sincerely hope that all our wonderful Chatham House guests realize what a treat they have here. So let me stop there, and please give us a few thoughts, and I'm going to ask you a variety of questions, depending on what you say, but let me start by provoking you. Were you daft enough to watch or listen to the debate last night? And irrelevant of that, what do you think of this talk of a V-shaped recovery in the States?
I did watch the debate. It was not an inspiring spectacle making the case for democratic systems with a small d. There's a sense in which you could say that the world's authoritarians were the winners from the disappointing character of the debate, and there should be no confusion. There was no symmetry of sin. The disappointment of the debate was a function of the President of the United States' disrespect for the office he holds and the people he purports to lead. It was, in my view, a shameful spectacle, with the only redeeming virtue in the situation being that it's appearing increasingly clear that my reaction was widely shared with what are, I suspect, likely to be adverse consequences for the president's already very problematic political prospects. With respect to the recovery, Jim, and let me just say, I was excited to say something about the debate, but let me just thank you before I say anything further for your very generous words of introduction. They brought back the observation about how Lyndon Johnson used to respond when he was introduced in a very generous way. I wish my parents had been here for that. My father would have appreciated it, and my mother would have believed it. And so thank you. And my only disappointment in this entire episode is that your introduction didn't go on much longer, since it was giving me much more pleasure than anything that I am going to
actually, Larry, sorry, Larry, I'm going to jump in and say one other thing that given that nice comment that I meant to say, amongst the reasons why I feel about the breadth of your expertise is, I don't know if you recall even saying this, but it's the very lengthy and wonderful leaving event for Mervyn King that was hosted at the LSE. I remember you being on a panel that was pursuing what influenced central bankers or what they'd learned from the crisis. And you came out with this really, it seemed to me a lot of people there missed it, but it really had a huge influence on me. You said that the reality is that actually central bankers are only ever really important when events happen that they're not trained to deal with. And I thought that was a fantastic thing.
Well, thank you for reminding me of that aphorism, which I am now, thinking about it, proud to have coined. Because thinking about it, I think it's broadly correct. Look, I think Jason Furman had the right paradigm for thinking about this crisis when he said that it should be divided into three phases: collapse, bounce back, and slog. And I think collapse was harder than we might have guessed in March. Bounce back has been stronger than I certainly would have guessed in May, in part because the collapse was greater, in part because I think I underestimated the extent to which, if you told people they weren't allowed to go to the store, there'd be a big decline. And then if you told them they were allowed to go to the store again, it would bounce back, and it might bounce back extra because of all the things they weren't able to buy at the store when they couldn't go. But I think slog's going to be longer than a lot of people think. I think we are set up now for a variety of aftershocks. The coming of winter and fatigue with being responsible is likely to lead in the industrial world to more COVID problems. Vaccines are likely to take a bit longer than people think, just because it's the first law of complex human endeavors that they come in behind schedule much more frequently than they come in ahead of schedule. Everybody diagnosed this problem as transient at the beginning. As a consequence, they depleted reserves. They didn't undertake major structural changes. And now, as they realize that this is a longer-term problem, they will do those things. They will stop paying debts that they decided to service for a while. They will lay off people who they thought they could keep on payroll all the way through. And all of that will take us another leg down. Tenants haven't been paying landlords for a long time. That's going to mean before long, landlords are going to stop paying mortgages. That's going to lead to financial shocks that are going to reduce the capacity to lend. And governments, as it seems like they always do, are already encountering stimulus fatigue and are ready to pivot to other kinds of problems. So I think the pace of recovery is going to slow very substantially. I think the risk that we'll have a negative quarter of US GDP growth in 2021 is probably 25 or 30%. And I think it would be a serious mistake to assume from the rather happy character of markets at the moment and the backwards looking figures that we're going to converge back to the former growth path. That's not a certain prediction, but I would say that corresponds to my best guess. And I think the 25% chance of at least a 1/4 decline is probably a bit higher than what is in the consensus. I also think there's a big wild card around the future of emerging markets. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's something like Africa is about 20% of the world's population, and so far about 4% of the world's COVID. That's not what I would have expected. And sometimes when things aren't what you expect, things catch up. And so I suspect there's going to be very substantial strain in emerging markets, larger than we've seen, and that will reverberate back on the global economy.
So Larry, already you raised so many things linked to questions, and I'm going to try to be more focused than I sometimes can, because we've got lots of people that are going to want to ask you things. But on domestic policy, the markets seem to be buzzing the past since they opened today that there is increased chance again for a new fiscal package. Where do you sit on that? And are we in the right ballpark, or are you still, or would you be very much in the camp that for this kind of mess we need to still unfold scales of fiscal stimulus that Congress isn't being offered yet?
Tell you what, I'm going to give a slightly extended answer to this question, and I promise I'll give really brief answers to all the other ones. How about that?
I'll let you do that.
I mean, I realize there's a dynamic consistency problem in that promise, but you gave me my cue to talk about secular stagnation.
I did.
I think the problem of our era is that there's basically more desire in the private sector to save than there is productive, profitable investment opportunity. That imparts a chronic bias towards sluggish growth, deflation, low interest rates, and inflated asset prices as the savings go into existing assets. I think the increased uncertainty, increased reduction in reliance on e-commerce, and further demassification of the economy associated with COVID makes all of that worse. Markets are saying that the odds are 80 to 90% that rates will basically be at near floor levels 5 years from now. The kind of gyrations in monetary policy that we've used to stabilize economies are going to be infeasible for the foreseeable future. Inflation targets are not going to be exceeded for the foreseeable future. And so the relevant macroeconomics is going to be the macroeconomics of the 1950s and 60s, when we thought of a world with chronically low interest rates, and we thought of fiscal policy as the dominant stabilization tool. There are grounds for concern about debt sustainability, but they are quite remote. If the Maastricht criteria were the right criteria at a moment when European interest rates were 8%, and when European real interest rates were 3 to 4%, then surely the right fiscal criteria in terms of what kinds of debt you can sustain are very profoundly different at a moment when real interest rates are significantly negative and nominal interest rates are in very little danger of breaking two, even for the longer term. So we are going to need to emphasize fiscal policy as we think about macroeconomic policy going forward. And the two most important insights are much more room for fiscal policy when interest rates are low. And this nobody talks about, but it's very important, you can have expansionary fiscal policy without changing the budget deficit. You can do that because of the balanced budget multiplier, more taxes and more spending. You can do that because of redistribution, transfers from rich people to poor people who have a higher marginal propensity to consume. And you can do it through the provision of social insurance or intergenerational transfers, such as Social Security or stronger health and disability insurance, that reduce the incentive for private actors to save and absorb saving. All of those things are going to be at the heart of stabilizing the economy. There is a risk that I could lose too much weight and become anorexic. Alas, starting where I am, it is a relatively remote risk. Similarly, the risk that we will excessively fiscally stimulate the American economy and cause it to overheat in an irreversible way is a remote risk starting from where we are. And were it to seem to come, it would be easily dealt with the kinds of tax increases that are probably ultimately desirable, but currently politically infeasible. So yes, we should be engaged in substantial fiscal stimulus. I would argue, however, that 3 months ago was the time, and certainly now is the time, to engage in fiscal stimulus that is also contributing to the long-run health of the society, not merely palliating the consequences of COVID. So priorities for me would be increased support for state and local investment. The longer the lags are on infrastructure, the more important it is to get started on a major program of infrastructure renewal. 5% of any stimulus bill should be devoted to testing, vaccinating, contact tracing, and putting behind us a problem that is costing the global economy on the order of $10 to $15 billion a day. Any half-sensible expenditure to contain COVID is surely worthwhile. So that would be the way I would think about fiscal stimulus going forward. And it would be a massive error to do what the political process will always be tempted to do, which is declare victory at some point with respect to COVID, put trust in Say's law about savings always being absorbed by investment, and pivot towards some kind of concern with posterity. I am not sure that reducing budget deficits is one of the 5 most important things we can do for prosperity. Addressing the deferred deficit in our infrastructure, in our education systems is surely more important. Climate change is surely more important. Preventing pandemic is surely more important. Rebuilding confidence in public institutions, ability to create a just and equitable society is surely more important, and possibly containing the growth of government debt is 5th, although I would regard adequate investment in our children and in the capacity of families to bring up their children as being a more important priority than that.
Wow. So it's irresistible, or the 2 things that come out straight out. One is the Fed that I'll come back to, but in the event of a Biden victory, any special insights for Chatham House as to who might be sitting in the hot seat of economic policy under Biden?
That is as clear a question as any, where the old remark about those who say don't know and those who know don't say. And either possibility with respect to me militates in favor of my not saying anything. So I'm going to pass on that question.
I thought thoroughly understandable, but I was encouraged to do that. But let's turn to the Fed's shift. Is that something in your view of substance, or does it sort of fit in the context of what I reminded you about what you said at Mervyn's leaving event with what they announced at Jackson Hole?
I think we're rearranging the furniture on the Titanic 24 hours before the iceberg. If they did a good job of steering the Titanic and knowing where they're going, they wouldn't hit the iceberg. And we've got the possibility of managing the economy right and working our way through our problems. But it didn't really have anything to do with how good a job they did of rearranging the furniture on the decks of the Titanic. And I don't think that this action of the Fed is very consequential. Look, I think in the modern world, central banks can play defense, but they can't play offense. And let me say what I mean by that. It's not right to say central banks are impotent. Central banks can do 2 very important things, and there's a 3rd thing they can't do. Central banks can restrain an economy anytime they want to. If the central bank jacked up rates, there's no question that they could send the economy into any degree of recession they wished. So they have the ability to pull on a string. Central banks can stop liquidity panics. Bank runs are the most obvious version of liquidity panics, but there are phenomena like bank runs that happen in capital markets with leveraged selling begetting more leveraged selling. And so central banks can stop panics and they can stop economies. What they can't do effectively from our current place is push on a string effectively to accelerate nominal GDP growth. They can't do that for 2 reasons. They can't do that because rates are already very low. They're the tools that central bankers find infinitely exciting, QE and forward guidance, are basically ways of, and the one that's really the holy grail of inexorability, yield curve control, are all ways of getting low long rates to go with low short rates. Hello, when the US 10-year rate is at 65 basis points, it's done, it's happened. And by the way, if we'd had a financial panic, if we'd had a financial decline and a recession of this magnitude, and they didn't do forward guidance and they didn't do QE, they just did enough to keep markets functioning, does anybody think that rates wouldn't be pretty low. So the scope for more movement through QE and forward guidance is very limited. Point one. Point two, the announcement that they're going for higher inflation has a bit the character of my announcing that I'm going to try to lose 50 pounds rather than 30 pounds. It doesn't seem pressing with respect to the current situation. And point three, and this is the point that is, I think, very, very important, but least in the consensus discussion. For half a dozen reasons, the interest sensitivity of spending has declined. Much less of spending is on durable goods than used to be the case. Markets basically function much better, so the kind of credit crunches that were characteristic of earlier business cycles are much less present than they used to be. At very low rates, target savings effects, where it goes in the wrong direction, become much more important. At high levels of debt, the reduction in disposable income associated with lower interest rates becomes much more important. So it is delusional to think that getting interest rates from 60 basis points to 20 basis points, if you could do it, would have some kind of large impact on spending. So yes, it was kind of the right thing to make clear that you weren't going to be inflation obsessed. Yes, it was the right thing to do. Look, I said 4 years ago in the FT that the Fed needed to adopt what I called the whites of the eyes position on inflation, which was no preemption of inflation based on Phillips curve theories and speculative estimates of the natural rate. You could tighten to stop inflation when there was inflation. That was right when I said it 4 years ago. It would have, if the advice had been taken then, it would have avoided a certain amount of mischief and excess volatility. It's good that they're taking that choice now, but again, I don't think it's hugely important. From my perspective, and this is a contrarian perspective perhaps, and perhaps is not what you'd expect me to say given other things that I've said, I don't think they bought much of anything on long rates by promising to keep them low for 3 years, because they were low already and they were going to be low and nobody particularly thought rates were going to go up. So I think the commitment didn't buy them much stimulus today. And if I've learned anything in my 30 years of doing these kinds of policies, it's that nobody knows the future with precision. And so you should ask yourself, whenever you say or do anything, if what you think of as a 2 standard deviation event happens, how bad will it be? And what you think is a 2 standard deviation event is probably really a 1 standard deviation event, since there's always a wider range of outcomes than people can contemplate. So I don't think it's going to be a problem, but I think the odds are not trivial that they're 20%, that something will be happening 18 months from now that will make it look advisable on financial prudential grounds or on inflation grounds to raise rates. And so why set yourself up to have a credibility problem if that situation materializes? Well, there's an answer to that question, because it's more important to reassure people and generate stimulus benefits now, but I don't actually think they generated much in the way of stimulus benefits.
So Larry, there's loads more, but I'm going to ask you two together of the two biggies. Choose your time as to how much you want to give to them. Then I'm going to open it up with Leslie to the audience. Yet again, we're going through, since the dollar started to decline in recent months, something you are only so familiar with, that this is supposedly the beginning of the era when the dollar's going to lose its influence, blah, 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 blah. Is it for real? Or is it just, I've heard that story before? And secondly, and in some ways more substantively, I think I'm technically right in saying you were the initiator of the G20 as a group, which kind of came into existence during the Asian crisis, but it really became notoriety, or got notoriety, of course, in 2008. What do you think? What would you do if you were in the same position of influence about global governance these days and the G20?
On the dollar, it's an exaggeration, but it's only an exaggeration of a basic truth to say you can't sell the dollar unless you buy something. And Europe's a museum, Japan's a nursing home, China's a jail, and Bitcoin's an experiment. And so I'm not sure what the dollar's going to fall against. The principal risk to the dollar is actually, in my view, not financial. It is the excessive use of the US leverage over the dollar to pursue its security and foreign policy objectives that causes everybody to decide they want to be resilient with respect to US abuses of power. And I think that is not a trivial risk to the dollar, but it is by far the biggest risk to the dollar. I am not worried about the dollar's decline in a financial sense, basically because I think our problems, large as they are small in relative terms. Look, with the leadership of Gordon Brown and President Obama, the London summit in March of 2009 was a major step towards containing the 2008 global financial crisis. It was a major step because of the strong commitment to replenishing the capacity of international financial institutions, because of a major step towards committing to keep markets open, because of a major step towards committing that surplus countries understood that the adjustment had to be of surplus countries as well as deficit countries, and because there was a major commitment to maintaining a flow of finance to developing countries, including through the private sector. It is fair to say that the audacity of the G20 communique from London was in some kind of proportion to the unprecedented nature of the domestic policies that were being pursued in the Euro area, in Britain, and in the United States. No remotely comparable claim can be made for any aspect of the internationally collective response today. The IMF is to be applauded for its calls for boldness, but the IMF is a creature of its shareholders, above all, its largest shareholders. Whether the issue is debt relief, whether the issue is the provision of finance on large scale to developing countries that need it, whether the issue is the provision of support for global public goods. By the way, the expected return time for pandemics, in my view, is on the more like a decade than like a half century. And so we need the infrastructure we didn't have for pandemic detection and rapid pandemic control, and that is expensive. All those things should be the substance of international cooperation, and whether it's debt, capital flows, international liquidity through SDRs, trade maintenance, or the provision of finance for global public goods, the G20 has been the G0 so far in this crisis. And one has to hope that early in a new US administration, that will change dramatically.
Larry, I'm going to bring some others in for questions, but I'll say now that it's incredible that I haven't had a chance to ask you about China yet. I want to know what you would do if you were to initiate a US policy on China today. But we'll come back to that if the others don't ask. So I can see we have Martin Wolf, Megan Green, and Korean Butler in that order lined up. So Martin, to you first.
My question has essentially been answered, so you can riff off
Jim, I
it.
can't hear Martin.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can, yes.
Okay. I was going to ask you, and I'll stick with it because you might have something you want to add. If you were President Biden's advisor, please God, it is President Biden, in January, what would you tell him, given, even if they win Senate and the House of Representatives, the limited number of things a president can do? What, in your view, will be the highest priority actions that he can take to heal, to minimize the damage and to recover as quickly as possible, not just for the US, but linked to that, the global economy? What are the things you would tell him to go for big time?
I touched in one way or another on most of the things, Martin. I would begin with an American economic renewal program that had as central elements public investment in everything that we've underinvested in, starting from infrastructure, moving quickly to science and technology, extending more broadly to investments in healthcare, particularly healthcare for children. I would finance that program in part with debt and in part with progressive tax increases. I would ensure that a significant part of the investment was in energy technology and renewable energy, because I think if we solve climate change, that's where a significant part of the solution will come from. I would motivate that program in part by the need for the United States example to be a powerful one, given the trends in the world and the challenges coming from China. I would not invest on the international dimension. I would have two primary thrusts: a thrust around global economic cooperation and growth that I just talked about, and a thrust around making global integration work for the middle class that focused on issues of corporate tax evasion, avoidance, and non-payment, and that focused on issues of races to the bottom in regulation. My objective would be to achieve something like what I spoke of in the FT several years ago when I wrote about the need for responsible nationalism in economic policy. It would be my objective to reject protectionism. It would not be my objective to make a major priority out of new trade agreements on the model of the trade agreements that have been under discussion in the past. Would also be my objective. It would also be my strong advice to President Biden, as it was to President Obama, that business confidence is the cheapest form of stimulus, and I would refer him to Keynes's famous 1937 letter to Roosevelt that spoke of the need to handle business with care. I would reject a redistributionist ethos in favor of an inclusion ethos that focused on growing the entire pie and making sure that those who had been left behind in recent times were disproportionate beneficiaries of that growth, but that we were all in this together, not least because of the need to compete with China.
Megan.
Great. Hi, Larry. I was wondering if you mentioned that winter's coming and that we're all going indoors, and there does seem to be a second wave on. And I was wondering if you have insight on why the markets don't seem to care and when the other shoe will drop, because they also don't seem to care that, you know, Biden wants to raise taxes. So do you have any views on that?
My view is that that there are two main things going on. One is that 30% of the market is FANG and FANG allies, and that the basic business prospects for those companies have gotten better, that it is possible that they are at political risk, but the debate over them will be immensely complicated because they are both looming concerns over the quality of our national dialogue and privacy and the like, and our national champions in global competition. And as those two forces battle each other, I think they're unlikely to be the subject of excessive negative attention. And the other thing is that the stock market, in my judgment, has a duration of 15 to 20 years, thought of as an asset, and that there's been a roughly 1 percentage point decline in real interest rates. And so that translates into something that should otherwise have produced a 15 to 20% gain. If you take the non-FANG stock market, it's not far off of flat. Cash flows are down for a few years, but the duration is 15 years, and cash flow estimates for 2026 probably aren't particularly affected, and the discount rate is way down. So I don't see an obvious case that there's a major bubble with respect to the market. Obviously, if we all go back completely indoors and we need to have a March, April style lockdown, that will turn out to be wrong. But on current facts, with a Fed put that's never been closer to the current level of the market, I am not led to think that markets are obviously overvalued.
The questions are piling up. Creon Butler next.
Thanks very much. If you look at the situation on climate change, the low carbon transition seems to be accelerating. You can see that in the car industry, and you can see it to some extent in the Chinese announcement on net zero. And I just wondered, what do you think that enormous microeconomic change is going to mean for the way the macroeconomy changes in the future? And what then does that mean for how fiscal and monetary policy and other macroeconomic policies will need to change?
I've spent my life as a macroeconomist primarily, rather than as a microeconomist. And that probably says something about my habits of thought, rightly or wrongly. I think there is a linkage. I think one of the world's better hopes for avoiding secular stagnation is the substantial investment requirement or opportunity associated with greening. And I think that this is an example. We tend to think of regulation as the enemy of investment. But in fact, to take a kind of stylized example, if we said that coal-fired power was going to be rendered illegal after 2025, it would be a painful regulation, but nonetheless a pro-investment painful regulation. So I think there is some nexus of investment demand. That said, you know, the basic laws of fiscal and monetary policy, the basic ways of thinking about fiscal and monetary policy, I don't think they're vastly different because of the pervasiveness of computers. And I think the pervasiveness of computers is ultimately a much more profound structural thing than the remaking of 10 to 15% of the economy around greening. So I am with you on making buildings more energy efficient. I am with you on moving towards more renewable energy. But if you ask me, will accomplishing those things change the core ways in which, to refer to Jim's former haunt, the Goldman Sachs Economics Group analyzes central bank and fiscal policies? I don't think it will be a dominant thing that will change the way they do that analysis.
We have limited time, so I'm going to ask the next three, or unfortunately to everybody else, they'll be the last three. If Larry, they all ask their questions and you can answer after the three of them. So we have Xiao Zhang, Tina Fordham, and Peter Goodman, please.
Larry, this is Peter Goodman. Thanks for taking my question. Just curious, when you talk about stimulus fatigue, what are the lessons of your experience in the Obama administration, and specifically the size of the stimulus, the composition of the stimulus in 2009, while the Democrats controlled Congress as well as the White House?
Tina?
Thanks. I wanted to talk about the market disconnect, picking on what Megan said a little bit. I mean, historically, markets have rallied when a Republican wins the presidency. At the moment, financial markets, I think, are more optimistic than the state of the polls that Trump might be reelected. And of course, further stimulus is what markets are going to need more than anything else in order to keep going. So I wondered if we're going to see a shift in the historic market reaction. And I would also like to say, I think all of us on this call are maybe overly optimistic about the chances of Biden, and haven't thought through as much the tail risk of a second term for Trump, and how a close election outcome will make that more likely. I think Biden will need to win clearly and strongly and with big states reporting early in the night to avoid a very messy outcome.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Xiao's question, Larry, which goes to my China one, which I'm grateful for, because it would be ridiculous to not have you offer some comments about China. And his question is, can the US really decouple from China? And with it, can the two work together to bring the world economy back on track as they did in 2009? And I will throw in my previous one linked to this. If you were today running the whole country and designing everything, if you were Trump, what would be your policy that you would initiate on China today?
What was Peter's question about?
About stimulus fatigue.
And lessons of the Obama administration.
Right, got it. Okay, let me take them in the reverse order that they were that they were asked. On China, look, I think the right broad attitude is that we are two men who don't like each other very much, in a two-oared lifeboat in a turbulent sea a long way from the shore. And our feelings need to be subordinated to the realities of our situation. I don't think we're likely to be in joint cooperation to rescue the world economy. I think that is naively aspirational. I don't think we can completely decouple given the nature of interdependence, but I do think we can reduce our mutual dependence and increase each of our resiliences. And above all, we can learn to practice what I like to call strategic empathy, understanding the desires of the other and the practical political constraints under which the others operate. I think for the United States, that will require taking a much more multilateral approach to China, and it will require doing what is almost impossible for the United States to do historically, which is to stop conflating a strategy with a wish list. The American idea of strategy vis-a-vis a country or a region tends to constitute a list of all the things we'd like to have happen in that place without a nuanced consideration of what concessions we are prepared to make or what limits exist on our ability to impose leverage. So I think that it is worth remembering what my poetry professor wife taught me from Robert Frost: good fences make good neighbors, and to recognize that a certain measure of strategic distancing is part of the maintenance of strategic harmony with respect to China. Tina, I tried to be careful in everything I said to recognize that there were a spectrum of possibilities, and particularly when I was commenting on central banks, to observe that what one thinks of as 2 standard deviation events are probably really 1 standard deviation events. So I think it is more likely that there will be a I think it's as likely that there will be a Biden landslide where he wins 400 electoral votes, where the comparison is Reagan's defeat of Carter, and where the Democrats end up in the range of 55 senators. I think that is as or more likely than the outcome that Trump wins. But both are plausible possibilities and need to be imagined. I think from where we are right now, the revulsion of the elites that would exist if Trump were to win would almost certainly have highly adverse market and social consequences for some time to come. I think the prospect that the election will remain on a knife edge for a lengthy period of time is considerably lower than the elite commentary suggests. I would be happy to make a bet that reflected a view that the odds were north of 75%, that on the Thursday after Election Day, you and I will be entirely clear as to who is president. But I agree with you completely that exciting as it is for political analysts associated with financial institutions to work through all the games and all the scenarios where we don't know who president is for a month, I think that's vitally important work to do, but I think it should be thought of as contingency planning for a one standard deviation tail, rather than as the most likely course. With respect to stimulus fatigue, look, I'm an interested actor, and this has been a matter of very substantial controversy within the Democratic Party. So I'm confident in what I'm about to say, but I should warn you that there are many people who would disagree with it. The Obama administration thought that it was a compelling imperative that there be rapid fiscal stimulus in an economy that was in free fall. That, I believe, was a correct judgment. I don't see how anybody can look at the history of the congressional debate or the congressional votes and believe that it was possible to have gotten a substantially larger stimulus program through the Congress in the first month of the Obama presidency. Yes, there were Democratic majorities in the Senate, but if one looked at the composition of those majorities, there were many people like Kent Conrad, the Democratic chairman of the Budget Committee, who basically were non-Keynesian in their perspective and focused on issues relating to budget reduction. And so to have achieved substantially larger stimulus in that period was, I think, not practicable. The error came, in my view, in the consensus view throughout the establishment that substantial deficits ran risks of default or substantial inflation, and that recovery, once achieved, would be self-sustaining at a substantial rate. Both of those were widely held American establishment views, led non-trivially by people speaking from within the financial community by the fall of 2009. They shaped the political debate. Republicans didn't want more fiscal stimulus on general Republican principles. Democrats were divided. The only people who were unabashed in their advocacy for stimulus were also people who were unabashed in their advocacy for nationalizing banks. And so they lacked credibility in the financial world on their ability to be authorities, even though they were right, that on the need for fiscal stimulus. And so a debate where there was not responsible opinion in favor of fiscal stimulus was a debate that shifted in the Bowles-Simpson kind of direction. The reason I use often use language about other deficits, deficits in maintenance, deficits in funding pensions, deficits in investing in education, deficits in providing adequate infrastructure, is to make clear that the fiscal expansion position is not one of short-term profligate orientation, but rather one of prudence at a time when, with many uses of money, there are surely better uses of money than paying down debt that carries a yield of less than 1% in a currency that a country prints itself. And so those would be the directions I would go and the lessons I would learn in terms of fiscal expansion.
Okay, thank you so much, Larry, for that. And the hour that's just sped by, I can't believe that we've run out of time. It's from a selfish perspective. There are hundreds of other things I'd love to quiz you about, but maybe we drag you back the day after election day and figure out whether that what is one of the biggest predictions I've heard on that comes to pass. So I suspect quite a few people listening in will be pretty pleased if it is, but we'll see. Thank you so much for your time here and your great leadership and influence on the miserable world of economics, but more importantly on your influence on all of our lives. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to hand you back things back to Leslie.
I would just echo what Jim said. That was tremendous. Boy, what a bright spot. 400 electoral votes, 55 senators.
To be clear, what I said was that was more like, I didn't say that was what was most likely to happen. I said that was more likely to happen than Trump winning.
No, and I did get that. I got that entire line, but still, you know, we're all very wary and realistic. But that was an interesting remark. Thank you. That was tremendous. Thank you to everybody for joining us, and thank you, Jim, for such a great job moderating. It was great for all of us to see the two of you in conversation. And Larry, I really hope you will come back.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Larry. Take care.